The first sound was not of coughing, nor of weeping, nor even of footsteps hurrying through deserted lanes. It was the bells. Iron tongues striking bronze hearts, tolling through the pre-dawn gloom with a weight that pressed down upon the soul. They rang slow and heavy, each reverberation seeming to crawl across the roofs, slither through alleyways, and sink into the bones of every trembling listener. In town after town, across the breadth of Europe, the bells did not call the faithful to prayer. They announced the dead. Again and again they pealed so often that the living began to lose count of the hours, the days, even the weeks. Some claimed the bells never ceased at all, that they became the very pulse of a world crumbling into silence. In the villages where the ropes hung slack, it was not because the dead were absent, but because the bell ringers had joined them. Beneath those tolls, the streets lay heavy with absence. A cart lurched down a cobbled lane, its wheels groaning under the weight of human cargo. The driver was cloaked, his face shaded by a hood that stank of sweat and fear. His cracked voice carried upward into the shuttered windows. "Bring out your dead!" The cry rose against the walls like a curse. No one answered at first. A shutter creaked open, and a pale woman peered down, clutching the hand of a child whose face was swollen, mottled with the cruel signature of the sickness. She did not call to the driver. She closed the shutter, as though wood and iron could bar the plague from entering. From another doorway, two men emerged, carrying a body wrapped in a soiled sheet. They heaved it into the cart without words, their eyes avoiding the others already piled there. A hand slipped from beneath the cloth. Stiff fingers curled as though still reaching. The driver spat, whipped the mule, and called out again. The cart rolled on, gathering its burden as it passed. The year was 1347. Europe stood at the height of its medieval order. Christendom stretched from icy Scandinavia to the sun-baked lands of Spain and Sicily. Cathedrals rose like stone mountains, merchants prospered in their gilded guild halls, and the papacy claimed authority over the souls of millions. Yet all of this wealth, power, faith, and custom would soon be shaken to its foundation, for death was not coming in the form of armies, swords, or fire. It travelled hidden in the fur of rats, in the bellies of fleas, in the unseen droplets of breath. It travelled in silence, until silence was all that remained. The Black Death, as it would later be called, was not the first plague to stalk the earth. In the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, a pestilence had ravaged Byzantium and left half of Constantinople in graves. But Europe had forgotten. Generations had passed in relative stability. The memory of that earlier terror faded into legend, as all forgotten catastrophes do. And so, when the bells began to toll in Sicily, in Genoa, in Marseille, in Paris, the people had no defence but fear. Imagine the marketplace of a thriving Italian city, stalls heavy with fruit, cloth dyed in deep colours, merchants crying out their wares. Then imagine the same market days later, baskets overturned, bread turning to mould, coins scattered on the ground where a merchant collapsed and was never seen again. Cats slink between the abandoned goods. A dead mule lies bloating in the street. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio described the horror in words that still chill centuries later. Friends fled from friends, brothers abandoned brothers, fathers left their sons to die alone. Corpses lay in doorways and stairwells, while the air grew so foul that one breath was said to carry doom. Whole neighbourhoods fell silent as though swallowed by the grave. In Paris, the historian Jean de Venette wrote that bodies piled so high in churchyards they overflowed into surrounding fields. Priests collapsed as they muttered prayers over the dead, and when those priests themselves died, there were no replacements left to bless the living. In England, a monk recorded that the bells of London rang so often they seemed to toll without pause, and that the sound of lamentation was everywhere, the stench unbearable, the terror endless. The bells became the voice of death itself. Yet this was not only a sickness of flesh, it was an apocalypse of the mind. The people of Europe had been raised to believe that the church was their shield, that sacraments safeguarded the soul, that prayer could stay the hand of judgment. But what use was confession when the priest himself collapsed before lifting the host? What use was a holy procession when the very crowd gathered for prayer spread the disease further? What use was faith when the Almighty seemed deaf to the endless cries rising from every town and village? For some, the plague was proof of divine wrath, punishment for sins too black to name. For others, it was the devil's work, loosed upon mankind by conspirators and heretics. Whispers of poisoned wells spread like wildfire. Suspicion of Jews, lepers and strangers fanned into persecution. The bells that tolled for the dead also told as a summons to cruelty, for fear knows no limits. But for many, perhaps most, the Black Death was something even darker, a revelation that the world was not governed by justice at all, that death was random, merciless and blind, that neither wealth nor prayer nor innocence offered protection. Such thoughts spread like shadow across the heart of Europe, lingering long after the pestilence itself withdrew. Still, in the midst of despair, some sought to record what they saw, lest memory itself be lost. Monks bent over parchment with trembling hands, their ink blotted with sweat as they described streets littered with bodies, mothers nursing children already stiff in their arms, fires consuming heaps of corpses because the earth could hold no more. These accounts are not numbers, they are cries from the abyss. A Florentine chronicler wrote, "Charity was dead, for fear was stronger than any bond of love." A Parisian wrote, "The living were not sufficient to bury the dead." And in London, a clerk wrote that whole families disappeared within days, as though swallowed by the earth. They wrote because writing was the only defiance left. Listen again to the bells. Hear them rolling through the fog of a village where dogs fight over scraps in the gutters. Hear them trembling over a river where bodies drift downstream, caught against bridge pilings. Hear them echoing from a cathedral tower where pigeons roost above an altar now surrounded by corpses. In their endless tolling is the rhythm of the Danse Macabre, the grim dance that binds rich and poor alike. No one is spared. Kings fall with peasants, bishops rot with beggars. The plague does not choose, it consumes. And yet, in the face of such equality in death, Europe's structures of life began to shudder. Economies faltered as fields lay unploughed, harvests rotted, and livestock wandered untended. Nobles found their manors empty of servants, lords discovered their armies thin to shadows, and the papacy found its prayers answered only with silence. The Black Death was more than a disease. It was a hammer, striking at the very foundation of feudal society. But in these opening days, when the bells first tolled in Sicily and France and England, no one could yet comprehend the full measure of what had begun. To those who lived it, the plague seemed a storm that would pass, a season of wrath soon to be lifted. They could not know that it was only the first act in a tragedy that would reshape the continent forever. For beyond the shuttered houses and the creaking carts, beyond the fields left fallow and the churches turned into crypts, something larger was stirring. The Black Death was not simply an end. It was the opening of a chasm in Europe's history, a rift from which new societies, new beliefs, and new terrors would be born. But for now, the bells still rang. The cart creaked through the square once more. The driver's voice, hoarse but relentless, rose into the still air. "Bring out your dead." Behind doors and shutters, families clutched one another, knowing their turn would soon come. And in the distance, across hills and rivers, from towers high and low, the bells of doom tolled on, unrelenting, inescapable, and eternal. This was not merely the beginning of an epidemic. It was the opening of Europe's dance with death, a procession to which all would be summoned, willingly or not. And though centuries would pass, the echo of those bells would never be forgotten. The curtain has risen, the dance has begun, the harbour of Messina smelled of salt, fish, and something else, something rank, sour, and new. The waves lapped against the stone piers, carrying with them the black-sailed ships of Genoa. At first, the townspeople rushed to the docks, eager for goods and gossip from the east. The air buzzed with the voices of merchants calling out prices, sailors cursing as they lowered cargo, children darting between barrels in hopes of some trinket or treat. But then the murmurs began. The sailors staggered down the gangplanks, not with the swagger of men returning from long voyages, but with faces pale, lips cracked, eyes sunken with fever. Some collapsed before their boots touched land. Others coughed crimson into their palms. A boy pointed at one man, whose neck bulged grotesquely with a swelling as large as an apple. The skin stretched tight and black. Women shrieked, pulling their children back. Priests crossed themselves, muttering prayers against the devil's work. It was late October of 1347, and death had stepped onto European soil. The Genoese ships had fled the east in terror. Their journey had begun in the Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genoese colony besieged by Mongol forces. There, it was whispered, the plague had already raged. Stories swirled, of corpses catapulted over city walls, of merchants escaping under the cover of night, of rats scurrying through cargo holds unseen. Whether these stories were fact or fable mattered little. The truth lay in the cargo, not just spices, silk and grain, but the invisible passengers clinging to the fur of rodents, nestled in straw, hiding in shadows. The people of Messina did not yet understand what had arrived. They spoke of a curse, of poisoned air, of a punishment carried across the sea. But they understood one thing: those who came near the sailors soon fell ill themselves. The sickness leapt from house to house, as if borne on whispers. Within days the harbour town was transformed. Imagine the narrow streets of Messina, once filled with cries of fishmongers and tinkling bells of mules. Now, shutters slammed closed at dawn, doors were barred, markets deserted. Those bold enough to emerge did so with cloths tied around their mouths, clutching herbs or charms. They hurried past neighbours, eyes averted, as though sight itself might carry contagion. Inside the homes, the sickness revealed itself with dreadful speed. It began with fever, with aches that drove men to their knees. Then came the swellings, hard lumps, black and purple, erupting in the groin, under the arms, along the neck. Victims screamed as the buboes grew, as hot as burning coals under the skin. Some vomited blood, their breath sour with decay. Others raved in delirium, clawing at their own flesh. And then, within 2, 3, perhaps 4 days, they lay still. Whole families collapsed before neighbours could carry the bodies out. Streets filled with carts with the cries of "Bring out your dead" echoing over the harbour. Priests hurried from house to house, offering what sacraments they could, until they too fell. The bells tolled until the ropes frayed. Messina was dying. Word spread across Sicily like wildfire. Some fled into the hills, carrying the unseen plague with them. Others sailed to the mainland, desperate to escape, unknowingly carrying death across the Mediterranean. In Marseille, the harbour gates were thrown wide to ships in need of water and bread. Soon the sickness festered in the alleyways of France. From there it spread north to Avignon, where the Pope himself locked himself inside chambers lined with blazing torches, hoping to purify the air with fire. The plague travelled faster than any army, swifter than any rumour. Wherever a ship docked, death followed. Pisa, Genoa, Venice, all fell within weeks. In Venice, gondolas carried not lovers but corpses, floating silently down canals where the stench rose higher than the salt tide. In Florence, the heart of commerce and art, the pestilence struck with such ferocity that even the wealthiest merchants found their coin could not bribe away the grave. From Italy it leapt to Spain, to France, and over the Alps into Switzerland and Germany. By 1348, the bells tolled in Paris, in Barcelona, in London. By 1349, the pestilence reached Ireland and Scotland, then spread to the cold shores of Scandinavia. It spared no kingdom. What struck the people most was not merely the speed, but the suddenness. Death had always been a companion. Wars, famines, and lesser plagues were familiar in the medieval world. But this was swifter than a sword. Chroniclers wrote of men who drank with their companions at night and were carried to the grave by morning. Children fell sick in the cradle before their mothers could whisper a prayer. Whole monasteries, once filled with chants, fell silent as brothers lay dead in their cells. In Siena, the painter Ambrogio Lorenzetti left his masterpiece unfinished on the walls of the Palazzo Pubblico, the figures of saints and rulers frozen forever in half-formed lines. He died before he could finish his work, leaving behind a testament of sudden interruption. The Black Death did not allow for closure, and still the ships came. Merchants, desperate to save themselves, fled from infected ports, steering for safer harbours. But safety was an illusion. Each ship carried rats, each rat carried fleas, each flea carried the invisible killer. No coastline, no fortress, no barrier of faith or wealth could bar its entry. People spoke of it, as though it were a living being, a dark angel sweeping across the continent. Some said it was born in the east, in the deserts of Tartary, riding the breath of storms. Others claimed it was carried by demons loosed from hell, who travelled unseen on the winds. Chroniclers noted that men and women alike saw omens: fiery comets burning in the sky, blood-red moons, rain that stank of brimstone. Nature itself seemed to cry out in warning. The truth that the plague was a parasite too small to be seen, thriving in the blood of fleas, was unimaginable. What they knew was only its consequence: death upon death, piled so high that earth and fire could scarcely contain it. The first act of the tragedy was over the pestilence had arrived. From Messina's harbour, the tide of death rolled outward until all of Europe stood within its grasp, and yet this was only the beginning. For the plague was more than a sickness of bodies, it was a sickness of society, of faith, of the human soul. It would tear apart families, unravel governments, and redraw the map of Europe in ways no one could yet imagine. But in those first days, when the ships docked and the sailors staggered ashore, the people of Messina knew only one thing. Something had come from the east, something invisible, merciless, and unstoppable. The bells tolled over the harbour, echoing into the hills, announcing not just the dead of today, but the dead of tomorrow. And as the sound faded, Europe shuddered, unaware that the dance with death had only just begun. Long before the bells tolled over Europe, before carts creaked through silent streets, before mothers wept at shuttered windows, the sickness was already moving. It did not begin in the harbours of Sicily or the markets of Florence. Its shadow stretched farther east, across deserts, steppe and mountain passes, where empires clashed and caravans threaded their way along the Silk Road. Here, on the edge of Europe's imagination, the whispers began. The East had always been a land of both wonder and terror to the medieval mind. From there came silk, spices, gold, and gems, but also tales of monstrous races, sorcerers, and demons. The Mongol Empire, vast and fearsome, loomed in these imaginations as a scourge unleashed by God himself. When Genghis Khan's descendants swept across Asia, their horses trampling kingdoms into dust, chroniclers in Europe described them as Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic nations foretold in Scripture. It was in this world of rumour and dread that the pestilence first found its battlefield. In 1346, the Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony perched on the Black Sea, was besieged by the Golden Horde. The Mongol armies encircled the city, their banners snapping in the wind, their war cries echoing across the walls. But among their ranks, something unseen began to fell them. Soldiers who had survived 1,000 battles now staggered with fever, their flesh swelling with hideous black lumps. Campfires burned untended, horses stood tethered beside their dead masters, and whole units collapsed into the dust. The plague had reached the armies of the steppe. It is here that history and legend entwine. According to a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Musi, the Mongol commanders, enraged at their losses, conceived a weapon born of horror itself. They ordered the bodies of their plague-stricken dead to be loaded into catapults and hurled over the walls of Kaffa. Imagine the scene: corpses sailing through the air, limbs flailing grotesquely, striking the cobbles within the city with sickening thuds. The defenders, desperate to repel siege engines and arrows, now faced a new terror raining death, not of steel, but of flesh. The chronicler wrote, "They ordered infected cadavers to be hurled into the city, so that by the intolerable stench the defenders would be killed." Whether the act truly unfolded in this way, or whether it was a later invention to explain the pestilence, we cannot know with certainty. But the image is indelible, the first act of biological warfare, born of desperation and vengeance. Within weeks, the disease spread inside the city walls. The defenders, trapped, found themselves coughing, swelling, and dying. The siege dissolved into a charnel house. When the Genoese merchants at last fled by ship, they carried with them not only silks and spices, but the invisible seed of destruction. Rats scurried in their holds, fleas nestled in the straw of their bedding. And in those fleas, Yersinia Pestis, the silent architect of apocalypse, waited. The ships that fled Kaffa scattered like frightened birds, sailing westward across the Mediterranean. Some landed in Constantinople, where the plague struck the Byzantine capital with fury. Others reached Alexandria, where it scoured Egypt and marched south along the Nile. Still others turned toward Italy, their black sails billowing as they sought safe harbour. Wherever they went, the plague followed. But the people of Europe did not speak of bacteria or fleas or rats. They spoke of curses, of Eastern sorcery, of a punishment carried on the wind from the lands of the Tartars. To them, the Mongols were not only warriors of flesh and blood, but emissaries of apocalypse. That they might have hurled corpses over the walls of Kaffa only confirmed the belief that the East was a realm of horrors. Whispers spread faster than ships. Some said the Mongols had uncovered ancient poisons, brewed in the cauldrons of shamans. Others claimed demons had ridden with them, loosing sickness from their nostrils. There were even those who believed the Antichrist himself had been born in those lands, and this pestilence was his herald. Even in distant England, where the plague had not yet arrived, rumours of the East reached trembling ears. Chroniclers wrote of a mortality among the heathens, of vast nations perishing in their multitudes. Some claimed that the earth itself had opened in China, spewing forth fumes that poisoned the air. Others told of earthquakes, floods, and showers of fire, omens of the world's end. For medieval Europe, the East was not merely geography. It was a canvas on which fear painted its wildest shapes. Yet within those whispers lay fragments of truth. For modern historians, the trail of the plague does indeed seem to lead eastward, toward China and the Central Asian steppes. There, in the rodent populations of the high plateaus, the bacterium had long lingered, flaring into outbreaks before retreating again. Trade routes the veins of medieval commerce carried goods, wealth, and death alike. The caravans that wound their way from east to west bore not only silk but plague-ridden fleas in their packs and pelts. The siege of Kaffa, whether or not bodies truly flew across its walls, was a turning point. It was the hinge upon which the disease swung into Europe. By sea and by rumour, it came. Consider the sailors who fled from Kaffa. Their voyage was not one of triumph but of terror. They coughed and bled as they hauled ropes, their groans mixing with the creak of timbers. At night the rats scurried unchecked, gnawing at grain sacks, their fleas leaping from fur to flesh. One by one, sailors collapsed, until only a handful remained upright, steering ghost ships into unsuspecting harbours. When those ships reached Messina, Genoa, and Marseille, they carried more than cargo, they carried the end of an age. And yet, the survivors of Kaffa did not see themselves as harbingers of doom. They believed they had escaped, outrun the Mongols and their curse. They did not know that the East itself had followed them, silent, unseen, and merciless. Europe, meanwhile, strained too, to interpret the whispers. Was this the punishment long foretold? Had the horsemen of the apocalypse ridden forth? Chroniclers turned to the Book of Revelation, seeking answers in its cryptic verses. A red horse for war, a black horse for famine, a pale horse for death, were these not already upon the earth? Priests preached that the sins of Christendom had summoned the plague, pride, lust, greed, and the arrogance of kings. The fact that it had come from the East, from lands already marked as heathen and godless, only deepened the conviction that it was divine chastisement. Europe was not merely at risk, it was guilty. And so, before the pestilence itself arrived in full force, fear and guilt had already begun to rot the continent's heart. When, in later centuries, men told tales of the Black Death's origins, they lingered on the siege of Kaffa. Some described the Mongols as demons hurling their corruption across the sky. Others imagined the defenders choking on the fumes of rotting corpses. Still others told of merchant ships so cursed that every port turned them away, until they drifted aimlessly, crews of corpses rocking in the waves. These were not facts. They were legends, yet legends carry their own truth, the truth of what people feared, of what they saw when they looked eastward and tried to explain their own devastation. The whispers of the East became the chorus of Europe's nightmare. By the time the plague reached Florence, Paris, and London, no one doubted its foreign birth. To blame the East was convenient, for it kept the terror at a distance, even as it seeped into every home. The Genoese sailors, the Mongol catapults, the caravans from Tartary, these became the symbols of a disease that knew no border. But the plague was not bound to myth alone. It was real, and it spread with a logic beyond human control. What had begun on the steppes, among rodents and fleas, now entered the heart of Christendom. And still in the streets of Europe, the whispers continued. They hurled their dead into the city. They poisoned the wells. It is the wrath of God. It is the devil's work. The truth that invisible creatures smaller than dust carried death from host to host was unknown. And so fear was left to write its own scriptures. From the east came silk, spice, and knowledge. But from the east too came death. The siege of Kaffa was only a moment, but it was remembered as the moment when the door was thrown wide. The pestilence that Europe would call the Black Death had crossed the threshold. Soon the bells would toll, the carts would roll, the churches would empty, and the earth itself would gape to swallow millions. But in those early days, when the first whispers spread from east to west, the story was already written, for the plague had no homeland, no loyalty, no mercy. It came from the east, but it belonged to the world. It was not a knight in armour, nor a horde of raiders. It did not gallop across the plains with banners raised high. It did not roar like thunder or blaze like fire. It crept, silent, unseen. It moved from skin to skin, from breath to breath. The people of Europe never saw it, never named it, and yet they felt its hand everywhere. It was the enemy they could not strike, the assassin that walked at their side. The Black Death was invisible. Modern science gives it a name, Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so small it could fit by the thousands on the head of a pin. It lived in the guts of fleas, fleas that infested the black rats nesting in the granaries, ships and homes of Europe. When the fleas bit their hosts, the plague leapt into bloodstreams, multiplying at a speed that defied imagination. The rats died in droves, their fleas desperate for new meals. They leapt to humans. They bit, and death began its dance. But to the people of the 14th century, these truths were unknowable. They had no microscope, no germ theory, no conception of invisible life. They could not imagine that tiny creatures might carry so vast a destruction. Instead, they searched for answers in the signs they could see, smell, and feel. And everywhere they looked, the world seemed poisoned. They spoke of miasma, foul airs rising from swamps, from rotting corpses, from open cesspits. The very breath of the earth was suspected of carrying corruption. Physicians advised the burning of fragrant woods, the carrying of herbs such as rosemary and lavender, the fumigation of houses with vinegar and smoke. Men pressed posies to their nostrils, women clutched pomanders of cloves and ambergris, nobles paid fortunes for pearls ground into powders, said to purify the air. But no matter how sweet the scent, death still followed. Others whispered of poisoned wells. Foreigners were accused of dropping powders and potions into the water. Jews, lepers and beggars were dragged before mobs, tortured into confessions of imaginary crimes, their blood spilled as though it could cleanse the land. In towns across Germany, entire Jewish communities were annihilated, burned alive in their synagogues, while the plague raged outside the very doors. Still, death followed, and then there was God. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for sins beyond reckoning. Priests preached repentance, flagellants scourged their own backs bloody, processions of the faithful carried relics through towns in desperate appeals for mercy. Bells tolled not only for funerals but for penitence, echoing the conviction that mankind had provoked the wrath of heaven. And yet, the plague struck priest and penitent alike. Monasteries emptied, bishops fell, the Pope himself hid behind walls of fire, and still death followed. Imagine the symptoms as they unfolded. First, the fever, sudden, searing, leaving men drenched in sweat. Then the pain bones aching, stomach twisting, head pounding with a heat that made thoughts blur. And then the buboes, swellings that rose under the arms, at the groin, along the neck, hard lumps, sometimes the size of eggs, sometimes as large as apples, swelling black and purple, hot and tender to the touch. Victims screamed as the swellings grew. Physicians lanced them with knives, releasing foul-smelling pus, but the relief was fleeting. Soon blood welled from the mouth and nose, staining sheets and lips with scarlet froth. Delirium set in, visions, wild mutterings, sudden bursts of violence or despair, and then silence. It could take a week. It could take 3 days. Some died within 24 hours. The invisible enemy wasted no time. There were other forms of the plague, though medieval men did not distinguish them. Some victims never grew buboes at all. but instead fell with fevers that left them gasping, their lungs filling with blood. This pneumonic form spread through the air itself. A cough, a breath, and the pestilence leapt from mouth to mouth. Whole households collapsed in a single night. Priests who came to hear confessions were infected before the sinner finished speaking. And then, the rarest and most deadly form, septicemic plague. In this, the bacterium flooded the blood so quickly that victims turned black with internal bleeding before a physician could even speak a prayer. Death came within hours. Chroniclers wrote of men collapsing in the street, healthy in the morning, corpses by vespers. How could any mind of the 14th century comprehend such a foe? Doctors tried. Some wore long robes, gloves, and masks stuffed with herbs, believing these might guard them. They studied astrology, tracing the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, claiming that the stars themselves had conspired to poison the earth. They advised diets of light meats, avoidance of baths, for warm water opened the pores to foul airs, and flight to the countryside. Wealthy families obeyed, locking themselves in villas far from towns. Poorer folk fled into the woods, but the plague found them there too. No cure worked. Bleeding only weakened the body further. Purging and vomiting left men exhausted. Drinking crushed emeralds, powdered unicorn horn, or alchemical elixirs enriched quacks but saved no lives. Every remedy ended the same way, with silence. And so, medicine faltered. Faith faltered. Reason faltered. What remained was terror. The invisible enemy gave no warning, offered no truce, respected no law of man or God. It struck down the innocent, the holy, the powerful, and the guilty alike. It moved faster than prayer, faster than hope, and worst of all, it left no time for the rites that anchored medieval life. To die without confession was to die in peril of damnation. To die without last rites was to die unshriven, unblessed. But how could the priest reach every bedside when he too was falling? How could graves be dug for every corpse when the diggers themselves collapsed? Bodies were tossed into pits, without ceremony, without prayers, without candles. The invisible enemy not only claimed lives, it stole souls. There were those who saw in this the hand of sorcery. Women accused of witchcraft were burned, their ashes scattered as though fire could smother pestilence. Others spoke of storms carrying poison dust, of serpents crawling from the sea, of a black wind that scoured the land. Chroniclers filled their pages with both fact and myth, unable to separate them. In their confusion, they painted a world where the boundaries of reality thinned, where death was both natural and supernatural. The plague was invisible, but its echoes were visible everywhere. Empty villages, abandoned fields, silent churches. It was as though a shadow stretched across the sun itself, blotting out certainty, casting mankind into a night without stars. And yet, for all its invisibility, the enemy left one mark that no one could ignore: fear. Fear was its second contagion, as deadly as the first. Fear drove men to abandon their families, to murder their neighbours, to burn strangers in their synagogues. Fear drove others into frenzies of devotion, whipping their backs bloody in desperate penance. Fear unravelled the bonds of trust that held towns, cities, and kingdoms together. The Black Death killed with buboes and fever, but also with suspicion, despair, and madness. And still no one could see it. We see it now. We know its name, its form, its method. We can trace the flea to the rat to the ship to the harbour. We can open a microscope and see the bacterium itself, a rod-shaped parasite twisting in stained glass slides. But to those who lived and died in the 14th century, it was the breath of hell, the curse of the stars, the wrath of God, or the malice of men. And perhaps, in that confusion, lies the deepest horror of all. For how do you fight an enemy you cannot name? The plague continued to spread. From harbour to city, from farm to village, from castle to hovel, the invisible enemy had no need of armies. It needed only breath, blood, and the warmth of life. And Europe had plenty to offer. Soon Florence would fall silent, Paris would stink of mass graves, London would drown in corpses. Soon kings would flee their capitals, popes would hide behind walls of flame, peasants would wander fields where no master returned. But in these early years, as the sickness festered in Sicily and Italy, as it crept into France and Spain, as whispers turned to screams, All that the people could know was this: death was no longer a distant shadow. It was in their homes. It was in their breath. It was invisible, and it was everywhere. The cities had always been the pride of Europe. Florence, with its merchants clothed in crimson and gold, its piazzas filled with laughter and song. Venice, the glittering bride of the Adriatic, her canals alive with gondoliers and traders from every corner of the known world. Paris, the jewel of Christendom, crowned with the spires of Notre Dame. London, brash and teeming, its markets humming with fishmongers, cloth sellers, and the cries of children. But when the plague entered their gates, pride turned to ruin. The laughter faded. The streets fell still. The bells tolled and tolled and tolled again, until their iron tongues cracked and their ringers lay among the corpses they had mourned. The cities of Europe became charnel houses. Florence, 1348. Giovanni Boccaccio, who would survive the pestilence and later write of it in the Decameron, remembered how the sickness moved with merciless swiftness. It began, he wrote, with swellings in the groin and the armpits, then came black spots on the arms and thighs, and in 3 days, death. At first, the people turned to their physicians. But Florence's doctors, men trained in the schools of Bologna and Padua, found themselves helpless. Their leeches, their poultices, their astrological charts offered no remedy. They bled their patients, purged them with laxatives, prescribed diets of figs and vinegar. None survived. Soon, physicians themselves succumbed. Those few who remained alive demanded impossible fees, and even the wealthy could not buy salvation. The plague struck rich and poor alike. In Florence's palaces, silk sheets were stained with blood and pus. In its hovels, straw mats rotted under the weight of fevered bodies. Nobles fled to their country villas, locking their gates, feasting in isolation. But the disease followed them, carried by servants, by merchants, by the very air they breathed. The city, once a tapestry of voices, fell silent. Boccaccio wrote, "Charity was dead, and each man looked only to his own safety. Husbands abandoned wives, mothers left their children crying in the streets. The sick died alone, their cries unanswered, their corpses left to rot until neighbours dragged them out with hooks and flung them into pits." Florence was undone not only by death but by the collapse of love itself. Venice fared no better. The plague arrived by ship, as it had in Messina, creeping into the labyrinth of canals. At first, the Venetians tried to contain it. They ordered ships from infected ports to remain at anchor for 40 days. 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine. But the rats and fleas did not wait. The sickness seeped into the city long before the decree could take effect. In Venice, gondolas no longer carried singing lovers or noblemen in masks. They carried corpses, ferried silently through the fog to the islands where mass graves were dug. San Michele, the island of the dead, filled with trench upon trench. Priests stood at the shore, blessing barges loaded with bodies, their arms raised until they too collapsed. The Rialto, once deafening with the cries of merchants, became a place of ghosts. Fabrics lay unsold, spices rotted in their sacks, gold weighed down tables no longer touched by human hands. Rats scampered freely through the empty stalls. Even the Doge himself hid behind locked doors, his palace echoing with silence. The city that had once ruled the seas trembled before an enemy too small to see. Paris was terror incarnate. By 1348, the plague had crossed the Alps and struck the heart of France. In the narrow lanes of Paris, where thousands crowded into wooden houses stacked 3 or 4 stories high, the pestilence moved like fire through dry brush. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Chroniclers wrote of carts so full that corpses tumbled onto the cobblestones as they rattled past. The cemeteries overflowed. At the Church of the Holy Innocents the ground could hold no more. Workers dug trenches, layer upon layer of corpses stacked until the pit brimmed, then covered them with a thin layer of soil, only to begin again the next day. The stench drifted over the city, sickening even those untouched by the plague. Priests refused to enter houses of the sick. Doctors fled. Judges abandoned their courts. The University of Paris, seat of Europe's learning, fell silent, and still the bells rang, so often that one chronicler wrote, "The sound of lamentation was everywhere, and the living were not sufficient to bury the dead. The people of Paris turned to prayer, to processions, to pilgrimages. Relics were carried through the streets, saints invoked, candles lit, but faith itself seemed poisoned. Priests died as swiftly as their flocks. Monks in their cloisters fell in heaps, their chants silenced mid-verse. The great cathedral of Notre Dame, where once the faithful gathered in tens of thousands, echoed with the coughs of the sick and the wails of mourners. Paris, the city of light, had become a city of shadows. And then London. In the autumn of 1348, the pestilence crossed the Channel. Borne on ships that docked at Dorset and Bristol, then crept along the Thames until it reached the heart of England's capital. London was a city of perhaps 80,000 souls, crowded, filthy, alive with trade. Its wooden houses leaned precariously over narrow lanes, its markets bustled, its taverns rang with laughter. The plague turned it into a necropolis. By 1349, corpses filled the churchyards so thickly that new burial grounds had to be consecrated. The fields of East Smithfield became one vast grave, where bodies were laid in long rows, priests chanting hurriedly as shovels scraped. So many died that London's clerks recorded them in haste, and then died such and such, page after page, until the ink itself seemed weary. Families locked themselves inside their homes, marking doors with red crosses. Watchmen patrolled the streets, forbidding entry or escape, yet still the plague crept through cracks and crevices. Dogs and pigs roamed freely, gnawing on bodies left in the alleys. The Thames, once thronged with barges, carried only funeral boats. One chronicler wrote that half the city was gone. Others claimed more. What is certain is that London, like Florence, Venice, and Paris, became a city of bells and silence. Across Europe the pattern was the same. Cities that had been centres of power and beauty became places of fear. Commerce halted, courts stood empty, councils collapsed, kings fled their palaces, parliaments dissolved, armies melted away. Even war paused, for what use was conquest when both victor and vanquished lay rotting in the streets? But the greatest loss was not of law or trade, it was of trust. Neighbours no longer greeted one another. Friends crossed to the other side of the street. Families scattered, each member fearing the breath of the other. Every man looked only to his own safety, wrote Boccaccio. In that selfish silence, the very idea of community disintegrated. The plague killed bodies, but it also killed the city itself. And yet, within that silence, voices endured. Chroniclers, trembling but determined, wrote what they saw. A Parisian monk recorded, "Such was the mortality that the living could scarcely bury the dead." An English clerk wrote, "There was scarcely enough left alive to bury the dead, and many houses stood empty, with none to dwell therein." In Florence, Boccaccio penned stories not only of death but of survivors who fled to the countryside, who told tales to pass the time, who clung to laughter even as the world collapsed. Even in the silence, humanity whispered, but the silence deepened. In Florence, grass grew in the piazzas where children once played. In Venice, rats scampered through palaces abandoned by their masters. In Paris, the Seine carried the stench of death on its waters. In London, the bells tolled until their ropes frayed, until their towers stood mute above streets lined with corpses. The cities had fallen silent. The Black Death had claimed its thrones, not with armies, not with fire, but with emptiness. And yet, this was not the end. For outside the city walls, beyond the stone gates, another world was waiting: the fields, the villages, the hamlets, where peasants tilled the soil and tended the herds. There, too, the plague would come. The silence of the cities was only the prelude. The countryside was next. The bells tolled in the cities, their iron voices echoing from cathedral towers, but in the countryside, the silence was worse. The silence of fields untended, of villages abandoned, of hearths gone cold. The Black Death did not stop at the gates of Florence, Paris, or London. It crept outward along the muddy tracks and winding lanes, carried by travellers fleeing the plague, by merchants desperate for safety, by rats hidden in sacks of grain. It seeped into the very soil of Europe, poisoning its villages as surely as it had its cities, and when it reached the countryside, it struck at the very backbone of medieval life. The medieval world was an agricultural world. 9 of every 10 souls in Christendom lived not in the great towns but in villages, clusters of huts, cottages and barns gathered around a parish church. Here, peasants bent their backs to the plough, sowed grain, tended sheep, and paid rent to their lords. Their labour fed the cities, clothed the nobles, and enriched the monasteries. The cycle of the seasons, the sowing, the harvest, the feast days, the holy days was the pulse of life. The Black Death shattered that cycle. When the pestilence entered a village, it spread as swiftly as fire through dry thatch. The houses, low-roofed and crowded, left no distance between bodies. Families slept close for warmth. Animals shared their stalls. Once the invisible enemy arrived, no one escaped. Entire households vanished within days. A father might die in the field, his plough left mid-furrow, the oxen wandering aimlessly. A mother might collapse at the hearth, the pot of pottage boiling over. Children were found dead in their cradles, flies buzzing around their still faces. The parish church, once the heart of the village, became its grave. Priests rang the bells until their arms failed, until they too lay in the earth. When no priest remained, the people buried their kin in silence, without prayers, shoveling soil in haste before fleeing back to shuttered huts. In some villages, there were no survivors left to dig. The dead lay where they fell, until wolves and carrion birds came to claim them. Chroniclers record that whole hamlets disappeared. Fields lay untended, weeds rising where wheat once rippled in the wind. Orchards rotted, fruit falling unplucked. Sheep and cattle wandered loose, trampling crops and breaking fences. In England alone, more than 1,000 villages would later be recorded as deserted. Across France, Germany and Italy, the countryside bore the same scars: empty houses, tilting barns, fields reclaimed by wilderness. The Black Death was not only a plague of bodies, it was a famine waiting to be born. For hunger soon joined pestilence. When labourers died, there were none to bring in the harvest. Grain withered in the fields, left to rot beneath autumn rains. Bread grew scarce. The few who remained alive scavenged desperately, digging roots, gathering nettles, stripping orchards of their last fruit. Livestock, untended, starved or fell to disease. In some places, survivors roasted dogs and cats for meat. Chroniclers speak, in hushed tones, of worse of human flesh taken in secret when no other food remained. The peasants who did endure found themselves wandering. They drifted from empty farms to abandoned villages, searching for food, for companions, for hope. Some hid in the forests, building shelters among the trees. Others took to the roads, a new kind of vagrant born of plague, gaunt and desperate. To see a stranger on the road was to feel fear, fear of contagion, fear of robbery, fear of a reminder that the world itself was unravelling. The lords of the countryside, too, felt the blow. Their wealth rested not in coin but in the labour of their tenants. When those tenants lay dead, the lords' manors stood empty. Rents went unpaid, harvests brought nothing. Castles, once bustling with servants and retainers, echoed with emptiness. Some nobles fled, to their hunting lodges or strongholds, but the plague followed. No moat, no wall, no armed guard could keep out a sickness carried in the blood of a flea. In England, chroniclers wrote of fields lying waste for want of men to till them. In France, estates that had stood for centuries fell into ruin. In Germany, vineyards withered unpicked. Even the mighty monasteries, whose wealth depended on vast tracts of land, faltered as their peasants vanished. The rural collapse was more than economic, it was spiritual. For the countryside had always seemed eternal, its rhythms steady as the turning of the year. Now, that illusion was broken. The plague revealed that even the soil itself could betray, that the order of life ordained by God and nature could be overturned in an instant. In some places, the survivors turned feral. Chronicles tell of villages where neighbours barricaded themselves against one another, where travellers were stoned from the roads, where wells were poisoned by fearful hands. Trust dissolved. With the parish priest dead, no authority remained but the strongest or the cruelest. In such villages, the plague stripped away the thin veil of Christendom, revealing something darker beneath. Yet in other places, cooperation flickered. Survivors gathered to farm the land together, to share food, to bury the dead with what prayers they could remember. They huddled in ruined churches, singing hymns in trembling voices. Out of devastation, tiny communities were born, fragments of humanity clinging to one another in defiance of despair. The countryside was both horror and hope, collapse and rebirth. Legends began to rise from the rural collapse. Peasants told of villages where no one survived, where wolves ruled the night, where the church bell rang by itself, though no hand touched the rope. They spoke of ghostly processions, farmers still ploughing the fields at dusk, though their bodies had long turned to dust. Shepherds whispered of flocks tended by, unseen figures, of phantom fires burning on deserted hills. The countryside, stripped of human voices, filled itself with apparitions. To the medieval imagination, the empty fields were haunted not only by the dead, but by the wrath of heaven. Some said the archangel Michael himself had passed through, scythe in hand, cutting men down like wheat. Others claimed demons wandered freely now, for the priests who once drove them back with prayer lay cold in the ground. Every ruined hut, every weed-choked field became a stage for new legends, woven from fear and loneliness. But beyond legend lay a harder truth. The rural collapse reshaped Europe forever. For when the pestilence at last loosened its grip, when the survivors crept from their huts and forests, they found a world transformed. Labour was scarce. Where once lords had commanded peasants with impunity, now peasants could demand wages, freedom and land. Better terms, they said, or we will go where the work island. Some lords resisted, clinging to the old feudal chains. Others yielded, for they had no choice. Across Europe, the collapse of the countryside cracked the foundations of serfdom. The Black Death killed millions, but for those who survived, it opened doors long closed. The old order was dying with the bodies in the fields. Still, in the darkest years of the plague, none could see what future might come. They saw only ruin. Imagine walking through a deserted village in 1349, roofs fallen in, doors swinging open, the churchyard filled with rough mounds. A child's doll lies in the mud, untouched. A plough stands in the furrow, its handles weathered by rain. The silence is broken only by the caw of crows. This was Europe's countryside. This was the rural collapse, and it did not end with the fields. For even as the land lay untended, a new figure began to haunt the towns and villages. The physicians in their strange black robes, their masks shaped like the beaks of birds. They promised cures, or at least protection. They became symbols of both hope and despair. The countryside had collapsed. The plague doctors were next. They came like shadows through the smoke of burning herbs, through the stench of corpses, through the wailing of mothers and the tolling of bells. They came robed in black, their hands gloved, their faces hidden behind masks that seemed not of this world. Long leather beaks jutted from their hoods, curved and hollow, stuffed with herbs and spices, rosemary, juniper, camphor, cloves. Round glass eyepieces reflected the sun like the gaze of an insect. The people whispered and trembled as they passed. Were these figures angels of mercy or spectres of death, healers or harbingers? They were the plague doctors. The image is unforgettable. A man shrouded head to toe in dark waxed fabric, a wide-brimmed hat upon his head, a staff in his hand, and the monstrous mask upon his face. He moved slowly through the streets, his staff tapping on the stones, prodding the bodies of the sick. To the terrified eye of the 14th century, he was no longer quite human, something between priest and crow, between saviour and executioner. But who were these men, really? The truth is stranger and sadder than the legend. In some cities, the authorities appointed physicians to tend the sick. They were not the famous doctors of universities. Those men fled at the first sign of plague, retreating to country villas. Instead, they were often second-rate physicians, desperate young men, failed scholars, or even charlatans eager for coin. They were given contracts, promising payment in money or privileges if they would remain among the stricken. Many died before their first month's wages were earned. Others were simple opportunists, wandering quacks who donned the costume to sell their false remedies. They peddled charms, powders, amulets, and ointments, promising protection from the pestilence. To desperate people, any promise was worth a coin. To the quacks, every death was another chance to profit. And yet, For all the fraud and folly, the plague doctors became symbols. Their very appearance was a declaration that someone, anyone, still dared to walk among the sick. The beak itself was born of superstition and of fear. Physicians believed the plague spread through miasma, the foul, poisoned air that rose from corpses and waste. If the air was corrupted, they reasoned, then it could be purified by fragrance. And so the beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, a portable garden of scents meant to ward off the invisible corruption. Some masks contained vinegar-soaked sponges, others held dried roses, mint, or even garlic. The doctor breathed through these, convinced that sweet air was salvation. The long robe, coated with wax or oil, was meant to keep the miasma from clinging to cloth. The gloves, the boots, the wide-brimmed hat, all were armour against the unseen. The staff served a double purpose: to examine patients without touch and to drive off the desperate if they came too close. To our eyes, it was primitive. To theirs, it was the height of reason. And still, the plague followed. Inside the homes, the plague doctor faced horrors beyond words. Imagine entering a one-room hut where a family lay sprawled in agony, a father groaning with swollen buboes, a mother coughing blood into rags, a child already still in her cradle. The doctor bent over them, his glass eyes reflecting their terror, his staff prodding their bodies. He might bleed the father, lance the buboes with a heated knife, prescribe a draught of vinegar, fumigate the room with herbs. He might press a charm into the mother's hand, whispering that it would ward off death. And then he would leave, the family's cries echoing behind him, knowing in his heart that none would see the next sunrise. The plague doctor became not a healer but a witness, one who watched the end unfold again and again. Some chronicles describe the doctors with pity. In Avignon, where the papal court resided, 2 plague doctors worked tirelessly, walking among the sick as others hid. They recorded symptoms, experimented with treatments, and died for their efforts. In Milan, doctors advised drastic measures, sealing the sick in their houses, walling them in with stone. The city lost many, but fewer than others, for the doctor's cruelty may have slowed the plague's spread. Other accounts are harsher. In Paris and London, people accused the doctors of profiting from misery, of charging fees for useless remedies, of abandoning patients when their coin was spent. Some were beaten, even killed, by mobs enraged at their impotence. And yet, whether charlatan or sincere, whether cowardly or brave, they linger in our memory as the black silhouettes of the age. The plague doctor became a figure of legend. To the terrified, he was almost supernatural, an omen walking in daylight. Children fled at the sight of him, believing him to be death himself. Rumours claimed that beneath the beak was no face at all, only bone. Others said the mask concealed demons, that the doctors were in league with the devil. Art and story seized upon the image. In woodcuts and manuscripts, the doctor is drawn with his staff and mask, standing amidst heaps of corpses. He became a symbol of the plague itself, indistinguishable from the death he sought to cure. Even centuries later, when the costume was adopted again during later outbreaks, it retained its aura of dread. The beaked mask remains with us today, a haunting emblem of the medieval apocalypse. But behind the mask were men, and behind the men were failures. The plague doctor could not save, he could not explain, he could not fight the invisible enemy. His herbs wilted, his lances festered, his charms turned to dust. The death rate was merciless. In some towns, 9 of 10 fell. No mask, no staff, no robe could stop what the flea carried, and the breath spread. And so the doctor walked, helpless, through streets, where the dead outnumbered the living. He walked past houses, marked with red crosses, past pyres burning by the river, past churches piled with corpses. His staff tapped, his beak jutted, his glass eyes gleamed. He was the embodiment of futility, clothed in leather and herbs, and yet people clung to him. For in a world where priests had fled, where lords had died, where neighbours barred their doors, the sight of a figure willing to enter the home of the sick was a flicker of hope. Even false hope is still hope. One can imagine a final scene, a village silent, its fields unploughed, a few survivors crouched in their huts, coughing. Into the lane walks the black figure, his staff clicking on the stones. Children peer through cracks in the door, wide-eyed, whispering, The plague doctor is here. He bends to examine a body. He scribbles notes in a ledger, recording symptoms. He burns herbs in a pan, the smoke curling into the air. He murmurs advice that will not save. Then he moves on, vanishing into the mist, leaving only the scent of juniper and the echo of his staff. The villagers watch him go, not knowing whether to feel comforted or cursed. The plague doctors did not conquer the Black Death. They did not understand it, and they could not stop it. But in their masks and robes, they became its most enduring symbol, the attempt of man to face an enemy too vast, too invisible, too merciless. They were not saviours, they were witnesses. They were shadows, and when the plague passed, when the bells fell silent and the fields grew green again, their image lingered. Long after the names of kings and nobles were forgotten, the beaked mask endured in memory, in art, in nightmare. For the people of the Middle Ages, the plague doctor was not the cure. He was the face of the disease itself. And in his black silhouette, Europe glimpsed not only its fear of the present, but its fear of the future, that death would come again, unseen, unstoppable, wearing the mask of a bird. The countryside had collapsed. The plague doctors had walked among the ruins. But worse was still to come, for the plague did not only test the body, it tested the soul. And in the streets of Europe, as death marched unopposed, faith itself began to fracture. The bells would toll not only for bodies, but for belief. The Black Death did not only hollow out bodies, it hollowed out belief. For centuries, the Christian faith had been the anchor of medieval Europe. It explained birth and death, joy and suffering, famine and harvest. It was the great chain binding peasant and king, alike beneath the gaze of God. The church stretched everywhere, priests in every village, cathedrals rising in every city, monks chanting in every monastery. It was a certainty, a refuge, an unshakable fortress of meaning. And then came the plague. At first, the people turned to their faith as they always had. The bells tolled, summoning the faithful to prayer. Processions wound through the streets, crosses raised high, relics carried aloft. Candles flickered, incense burned, hymns rose to heaven in desperate pleas. Men and women knelt on cold stones, whispering confessions, begging mercy. Priests urged repentance, warning that the pestilence was punishment for sins. The people believed them. But the plague did not listen. The priests who lifted the host fell to the ground, choking on blood. The monks who sang the psalms collapsed in their cloisters, their voices silenced mid-verse. Bishops in their vestments, abbots in their robes, nuns in their habits, all succumbed. The cemeteries of monasteries filled until no more room remained, and still the bells tolled for the dead. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI surrounded himself with fires, believing the flames would cleanse the air of pestilence. He gave absolution to all who died of the plague, for there were not enough priests to hear their confessions. But even in the papal city the corpses piled high. The people watched, and their certainty began to crack. If priests could die without sacraments, what hope remained for ordinary souls? If bishops fell like peasants, was the hand of God truly guiding? If prayer itself brought no mercy, what power did faith hold at all? Desperation breeds extremes. Across Europe, bands of men and women began to appear, their torsos bare, their backs bloodied by their own hands. They marched from town to town, chanting hymns, carrying banners, scourging themselves with whips tipped in iron. With every lash, their flesh split, their blood staining the earth. These were the flagellants, convinced that only by punishing their bodies could mankind atone for its sins. Crowds gathered to watch them, falling to their knees as the flagellants cried out prayers. In some towns, entire populations joined in, whipping themselves until the streets ran red. They believed that their suffering would turn aside God's wrath, that their blood would wash away the sins of Christendom. But their processions brought more terror than comfort. Wherever the flagellants marched, the plague seemed to follow. Authorities feared them, the Pope condemned them. Yet for a time, they roamed freely, embodying both devotion and madness. They were living proof that faith had shattered into frenzy. In villages, the collapse of faith was quieter, but no less devastating. A priest knocked at the door of a dying man. The family, weeping, begged him to enter. He hesitated. He had seen too many fellow priests carried to the grave after offering last rites. At last he stepped inside, clutching a sprig of rosemary before his mouth, muttering the prayers. Hours later, he too was coughing blood. Soon the village had no priest at all. What happens to faith when no one is left to speak its words? In many places, the people improvised. Laymen buried the dead, muttering half-remembered prayers. Mothers baptized their own children. Survivors gathered in ruined churches, singing hymns without clergy to lead them. The rituals frayed. The certainty crumbled. Faith became a shadow of itself, carried on trembling voices. Some abandoned religion entirely. Chroniclers speak of men who, convinced that God had abandoned them, gave themselves to drunkenness, gluttony, and lust. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, became the creed of those who saw no reason to repent when death was inevitable. Taverns filled even as churches emptied. In Florence, groups of young nobles retreated to country villas, feasting and telling tales while the city rotted behind them. Others turned to darker devotions. In Germany, cults arose that mixed Christian symbols with pagan rituals, chanting under the moon, begging protection from any spirit who might hear. In France, peasants muttered charms against demons, nailed amulets to their doors, smeared their thresholds with blood. When God seemed silent, men sought power elsewhere. The collapse of faith was not universal. Some clung to God with fiercer devotion than ever. In the face of the pestilence, they doubled their prayers, lit candles until churches glowed with light, confessed sins they had long hidden. Many believed the end of the world had come, that Christ's judgment was at hand. Their faith was not comfort, but terror. Yet even among the devout, questions gnawed. If God was merciful, why strike the innocent? Why take babes from the cradle, priests from the altar, nuns from their prayers? Why did the wicked live while the holy perished? Faith could explain famine and war, those were the punishments of an angry God. But what was the Black Death? Punishment, yes, but punishment without proportion, without justice, without end. It was as though God himself had gone mad. Legends blossomed in this vacuum. Some said that Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows, appeared in visions, offering protection. His image spread across Europe, painted on church walls, carried on banners, prayed to by the dying. Others turned to Saint Roch, who had once healed plague victims in Italy. His cult grew rapidly, though he himself had died long before the Black Death. People clutched medallions, kissed statues, begged the saints to intercede. But no matter the prayers, the plague rolled on. The church itself reeled. With so many priests dead, with so many monasteries emptied, its structure cracked. In some places, priests who survived grew rich, charging enormous fees for sacraments. Others sank into corruption, selling blessings for coin. Confidence in the clergy faltered. If the shepherds could not protect the flock, what worth was the flock's obedience? And yet, paradoxically, the church also grew stronger in the long run. For when the plague ended, survivors turned back to religion, desperate for stability. But it was not the same faith. It was darker, more anxious, more suspicious. It was a faith scarred by the memory of God's silence. Picture, if you will, a flagellant procession. The sun beats down on the cobbled square. Hundreds of men kneel, stripped to the waist, their skin pale and scarred. At a signal, they rise, whips in hand. With one voice, they chant a hymn, low and mournful. Then they strike. The iron-tipped lashes whistle through the air, cracking against flesh. Blood spatters on the stones. Again they strike, and again, until their backs are ribbons of crimson. Women weep. Children cry out. Some fall to their knees, begging God's mercy. Others turn away, horrified. And in the shadows, rats scurry, fleas leap. The plague moves unseen. The flagellants believed they were saving the world. In truth, they spread only fear, confusion, and despair. The Black Death tore faith apart not with arguments, but with silence. The heavens gave no answer. The earth gave no relief. The sacraments withered. The saints were powerless. The priests lay in the same pits as their flocks. The God who had been certainty became a question. And that question would echo long after the plague passed. For in the collapse of faith, seeds were sown, seeds of doubt, of skepticism, of rebellion. Centuries later, those seeds would flower into reformations, revolutions, and new philosophies. But in the 14th century, they were only whispers. carried on the wind through streets filled with the stench of death. The plague had shattered faith, and in its shards Europe's soul bled as surely as its body. Yet shattered faith did not end the story, for when fear breaks belief, it seeks an enemy. If God was silent, then surely someone else was to blame. Someone had poisoned the wells, someone had conspired with the devil, someone had summoned the plague, and so, out of broken faith came fury. Out of despair came violence. Out of silence came screams. The scapegoats would burn next. When faith collapses, fear demands a target. The bells tolled for priests and peasants alike. The plague crept unseen into manors and hovels, monasteries and taverns. It struck without pattern, without reason, without pause, and in the face of such mercilessness the human heart sought an answer. If God would not explain, then surely man must. If death was not divine wrath, then someone had unleashed it. Someone had poisoned the air, or the water, or the very soul of Christendom. Thus began the hunt for scapegoats. The whispers began in hushed tones. The wells are poisoned. Water had always been both necessity and symbol. In a world without clean sewers, the village well was life itself. To imagine it fouled was to imagine betrayal at the heart of existence. And so, when the plague struck, suspicion turned first to those already distrusted outsiders, wanderers, the marked, the marginalized. Jews, long despised and segregated, became the foremost victims. For centuries they had lived in Christendom under a fragile protection. Kings and popes alternately tolerated and exploited them. They were confined to ghettos, forbidden from many trades, forced into money lending and commerce that bred resentment. They were accused of usury, of deicide, of secret rites. In times of famine or war, their communities were easy prey. And now, in the terror of plague, they were accused of the ultimate crime, of conspiring to destroy Christendom itself. The accusations spread like fire. Jews had thrown poison into wells, people whispered. They had brewed powders from toads and spiders, smuggled them in leather pouches, scattered them in rivers. They had sworn oaths to the devil, promising him the souls of Christians. They had plotted with Muslims, with sorcerers, with demons. In Basel, Strasbourg, Cologne, Mainz, and dozens of other towns, such stories took root. Men swore they had seen Jews caught in the act, mixing strange potions, muttering curses. Tortured prisoners confessed to anything their captors demanded. Yes, they had poisoned the wells. Yes, they had plotted against the world. Yes, they had summoned the pestilence. Their words, wrung from agony, became the justification for slaughter. The pogroms began. In Basel in 1349, the city authorities gathered the Jews into a wooden structure built outside the walls. Men, women and children, hundreds in all, were locked inside. The structure was set aflame. Their screams echoed over the Rhine as smoke curled into the sky. Chroniclers recorded that not one survived. In Strasbourg, the massacre was even greater. On the 14th of February, 1349, long before the plague had even reached the city, the people rounded up their Jewish neighbours. Nearly 2,000 were herded into a square. Some were burned alive, others butchered with axes and swords. Their houses were looted, their possessions divided among the townsfolk. Chroniclers described the crowd singing hymns as the flames rose, praising God for vengeance. Across Germany, France, and Switzerland, the pattern repeated. Communities that had lived for centuries were annihilated in weeks. Jews who could fled, seeking refuge in Poland or in the lands of the Ottoman Turks, where rulers offered them protection. Others perished in fire and blood, their names lost to smoke. But the Jews were not the only scapegoats. Lepers, too, were accused. Already outcasts, confined to leper houses on the edges of towns, they were easy to blame. People claimed they carried pouches of poison, that they smeared their sores into wells, that they had sworn to spread the pestilence. Many were dragged from their refuges and burned, their bodies added to the pyres already heavy with plague dead. Strangers and travellers, gypsies, beggars, even merchants from distant lands were attacked. Outsiders were beaten in the streets, accused of bringing the sickness in their packs. Foreign sailors were stoned at harbours, their ships set aflame. Even children were not spared, if their faces looked different, if their tongues spoke strangely. The plague had no face, so the people gave it one. Chronicles describe scenes of horror. In one German town, Jews were thrown into the river, their cries drowned by the current. In another, they were dragged behind carts, their bodies broken on the stones. Women clutched infants to their breasts as the flames rose, their voices lifted in the Shema, the ancient prayer of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Their words mingled with the chanting of priests who blessed the massacre. It was not only mobs. City councils passed laws ordering expulsions. Princes signed decrees confiscating Jewish property. Bishops looked away, or even encouraged the killings. Though Pope Clement VI issued bulls condemning the pogroms, declaring the Jews innocent of the plague, his words carried little weight in the chaos. Fear was stronger than papal authority. The plague was invisible, but vengeance was not. Not all Christians joined in the slaughter. There were some who sheltered Jewish neighbours, who defied the mobs, who insisted that the accusations were madness. In certain towns, local lords intervened, protecting their Jewish communities, because they valued their tax revenues. But these were rare exceptions. For most, fear drowned compassion. The Black Death unleashed humanity's darkest impulses. In the shadow of death, men sought not understanding but blood. The pogroms did not halt the plague. Towns that burned their Jews still lost half their population. Villages that slaughtered lepers still lay silent. Wells cleansed with fire still stank of decay. But the violence left scars that endured long after the pestilence passed. Whole communities vanished. Centuries of Jewish life in Western Europe were erased. The survivors carried their grief eastward, into Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire, planting new roots in lands where the memory of betrayal never faded. The scapegoating revealed something deeper. The plague was not only a test of the body or of faith, it was a test of humanity, and in town after town, humanity failed. When neighbours turned on neighbours, when priests blessed slaughter, when children watched their friends thrown into flames, the bonds that tied Christendom together frayed. The unity of faith, already shaken by silence, was poisoned by blood. Europe did not collapse, but it became darker, crueler, haunted by the memory of its own violence. Legends grew around the massacres. Survivors whispered of miracles, of Jews who walked unburned from the flames, of lepers who cursed their captors and brought pestilence down upon them. Christians told of wells that bubbled black after poison was poured, of devils who danced at the stake. These were not facts, but they carried the weight of truth to those who needed to believe. The plague demanded a story, and the scapegoats provided it. Picture Strasbourg in 1349. The square is filled with a crowd, men clutching axes, women carrying torches, children perched on shoulders. At the centre a pyre rises, its wood stacked high. Bound together, a mass of Jews, old men with beards, young mothers with infants, children clutching. One another are herded forward. Priests raise their hands in blessing. The crowd roars approval. The torches touch the wood. The flames leap high. Smoke billows, screams pierce the air. The crowd chants, convinced they are purging evil. And in the alleys nearby, rats scurry, fleas leap. The true plague moving on unseen. The scapegoats burned, but the pestilence did not falter. The pogroms revealed the futility of fear turned outward. They showed how quickly the human mind, unable to bear the terror of randomness, invents enemies. Better to believe in poisoned wells than in an invisible foe. Better to kill neighbours than to admit helplessness. Better to burn the innocent than to confess ignorance. The Black Death slaughtered millions. But the pogroms slaughtered trust, and when the fires died down, when the wells still stank of death, when the plague still rolled on, the people looked around and realized that no scapegoat could save them. Death was universal. Death was impartial. Death was dancing with everyone. And so, from the ashes of the pogroms, a new symbol began to emerge. Not the beaked doctor, not the burning scapegoat, but death itself personified, impartial, inevitable. Art began to show skeletons leading men and women of every rank in a grim procession. Kings, peasants, priests, children, all linked hand in hand, drawn toward the grave. The scapegoats had burned. Now it was clear. No one could escape. The dance of death had begun. In the silence that followed the screams, in the smoke that drifted from the charred remains of scapegoats, in the streets where carts still rattled with their burden of corpses, a new vision began to haunt the imagination of Europe. It was not the beaked doctor, nor the robed priest, nor the pyre of the scapegoat. It was something older, more elemental, and yet made suddenly real. It was death itself, no longer an abstraction, but a companion, a neighbour, a partner in every hour, and death danced. The Danse Macabre, the dance of death, was born in those years of pestilence. It was not a single invention, not the work of one artist or poet, but a collective vision, rising like smoke from the charnel pits. It appeared first in whispered tales, of skeletons walking the roads at night, of corpses rising from graves to join processions, of pale figures seen at the edges of battlefields and plague-struck villages. Soon, the vision took form in paint and ink. On the walls of churches, artists drew skeletons leading the living by the hand, kings in crowns, bishops in mitres, merchants clutching purses, peasants with hoes, maidens with flowers. All danced in a circle, their fleshless partners grinning as they pulled them into the grave. In manuscripts, scribes sketched margins filled with cavorting corpses, their jaws gaping in eternal laughter. In songs, minstrels sang verses of death summoning all, mocking pride and rank. In sermons, preachers invoked the image, "See how death spares none, neither prince nor pauper, neither virgin nor widow, neither the young in swaddling nor the old bent with years." The dance of death was not fantasy, it was memory, for the Black Death had made mortality universal. It had proven that crowns and mitres were no defence, that castles fell as swiftly as cottages. The plague struck popes and kings, nobles and beggars, without distinction. To the medieval imagination, this was revelation. Death was the great equaliser, the one truth no man could escape. The dance of death became both terror and comfort. Terror, because it reminded every living soul that the grave was waiting just beyond the next breath. Comfort, because it insisted that all would go together, that no man, however mighty, would walk exempt. In a world shattered by plague, this strange equality was a kind of solace. Picture a mural in a church outside Paris. Along its walls, skeletons painted in stark black and white stretch their bony hands toward the congregation. One clasps the hand of a bishop, pulling him from the altar. Another grips a soldier, dragging him from his sword. Another dances with a maiden, her veil fluttering as she gazes into empty sockets. Beneath each figure, a verse is written, a reminder that riches, learning, beauty, and strength are all swallowed by the grave. The parishioners who gathered beneath those murals did not see allegory. They saw truth. They had buried neighbours, priests, children. They had watched lords collapse in their halls. They had seen death's face too often not to recognise it in bone and grin. The dance of death also reshaped art in subtler ways. Tombs that once displayed knights in serene repose now depicted them as rotting corpses, worms crawling from their eye sockets. These transy monuments declared, "Here lies a man who was once powerful, now devoured by earth." Sculptors carved cadavers wrapped in shrouds, ribs visible, skulls grinning. Painters, too, darkened their palettes. Where once saints glowed in radiant colours, now shadows crept across canvases. Christ still reigned, but behind him loomed skeletons. The Virgin still held the infant Jesus, but beneath her feet corpses writhed. Death entered the iconography of faith, no longer denied but embraced as inevitable. Even literature bore the mark. In England, poets spoke of life as fleeting, a candle in the wind. In France, ballads mourned beauty that faded, wealth that vanished, power that crumbled. In Italy, Petrarch, mourning friends lost to the pestilence, wrote of time as a devourer, relentless and impartial. The plague had given Europe a new muse, mortality. The dance was not only an art, it was in daily life. Children played games called the plague, pretending to collapse, their companions chanting grim rhymes. Minstrels composed mocking songs, their refrains reminding all that tomorrow they might join the dance. In marketplaces, peddlers sold trinkets carved with skulls, rings engraved with the words memento, mori, remember, that you must die. In monasteries, monks copied texts with new fervour, their margins filled with drawings of death. Some wrote that the pestilence had stripped the world of vanity, teaching men to turn their minds to heaven. Others wrote with bitterness, noting that the plague had taught men only despair. But all agreed, death was no longer a distant fate. It was a daily companion, and so, in the collective imagination, death ceased to be still. He became a figure in motion, always moving, always pulling, always dancing. His skeletal hand reached for kings in their thrones, for peasants in their fields, for brides at their weddings, for children at their games. None could refuse the invitation. The universality of the dance was its power. In a world stratified by class and faith, it declared equality in the grave. The bishop who preached, the knight who fought, the merchant who counted coins, the maiden who braided flowers, all would dance. Death's circle was unbroken. This vision was both medieval despair and medieval wisdom, for if all must dance, then all were united in mortality, and perhaps, in that strange communion, there was meaning. But the dance was not only an equalizer, it was a mocker. Artists painted skeletons grinning as they dragged cardinals by the sleeve, clutching emperors by the crown, plucking maidens from their betrothals. The dance was satire, laughter at the futility of human pride. Death did not come solemnly. He came jesting, capering, mocking the vanities of life. He was both executioner and jester, both terror and humour. For in the face of overwhelming death, laughter was itself a form of survival. To laugh at the skeleton was to rob him of his sting. To dance with him was to accept what could not be avoided. Thus the dance became not only art but ritual, a way of coping, of naming the unnameable, of giving shape to despair. Legends of the dance spread. In Lübeck, a great mural showed death leading a procession through the city, calling out names. In Basel, another mural depicted skeletons cavorting with nobles and peasants alike. Travellers wrote of them with awe and dread, carrying the vision to other lands. The dance became a European language of grief. Even plays and pageants adopted the motif. Actors dressed as skeletons paraded through festivals, reminding the living that merriment was shadowed by mortality. Sermons thundered the same theme. As you are, we once were. As we are, so shall you be. The graveyard became the classroom, the corpse, the teacher. Picture a marketplace in plague-struck France. A fiddler plays a mournful tune. A crowd gathers. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure steps forth draped in bones, a skull mask grinning, ribcage rattling. He bows mockingly, extends a skeletal hand to a young woman. She laughs nervously, takes it. Another skeleton appears, and another, until the square is filled with dancers. The crowd claps, some with laughter, some with tears. They know the truth. Tomorrow, they too may join the dance. The dance of death was not mere morbidity, it was philosophy. It declared that life was brief, that pride was folly, that all things ended in the grave. But it also declared that death was shared, that no man died alone. In the universality of the dance, there was a kind of equality, a kind of solidarity. It was perhaps the only consolation the Black Death offered. Yet even as art and song embraced the dance, the plague itself raged on. Cities lay silent, villages collapsed, faith shattered, scapegoats burned, and still the invisible enemy moved from body to body, reminding all that the circle was unbroken. The dance had begun, and it would not stop with Europe's art. It would step into England, into London, into the villages of the countryside. It would write itself into the very fabric of kingdoms. The bells would toll across the Channel. The Black Death was coming to England. The sea carried it, across the narrow waters of the Channel, where gulls wheeled and ships rocked with the tide. The pestilence crossed into England. The island had long been both proud and fearful of its separation, safe from invasion by geography, yet always aware that ships could bring not only goods but ruin. In 1348, ruin arrived. The first reports came from the coast of Dorset. Fishermen whispered of strange deaths in the port towns, of sailors staggering ashore only to collapse on the cobblestones. The sickness that had scoured France and Italy now crept into English harbours. From Dorset it spread to Bristol, the great trading city of the West. Chroniclers recorded that in a matter of weeks, Bristol lay still. Streets once loud with merchants and mariners were choked with corpses. The bells tolled until they cracked. From there, the plague moved eastward, following the roads and rivers, creeping toward the heart of the kingdom. London in 1349 was a city of some 80,000 souls, crowded within its ancient walls. Timbered houses leaned over narrow lanes, their upper stories nearly touching. The Thames flowed broad and foul, carrying barges laden with goods and sewage alike. The markets bustled with butchers, bakers, fishmongers, smiths, cloth sellers. Taverns rang with laughter. The bells of street pools tolled over all, a reminder of God's order in the midst of chaos. When the plague entered London, order collapsed. Chroniclers describe a city overwhelmed. In a single year, tens of thousands perished. Churchyards overflowed. In East Smithfield, new burial grounds were consecrated by royal order, vast pits where corpses were laid in rows, layer upon layer, sprinkled with quicklime and covered in soil, only to be reopened the next day for another mass of bodies. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover those pits. The bones still lined in their orderly horror. Londoners lived in terror. Families barred their doors, painting red crosses upon them. Watchmen patrolled to prevent the sick from leaving their houses, but many bribed their way out, carrying the plague further. Processions wound through the streets, but the prayers seemed powerless. Priests themselves died in droves, their vestments heavy with sweat, their lips stained with blood. The Thames, once alive with trade, bore funeral barges. Corpses floated in the current, snagging against piers. The smell of death rose over the city, mingling with the smoke of pyres. Records show that half of London may have died in that single year. Some claimed more. No parish was spared. Nobles and beggars alike lay in the same pits. The royal court trembled, withdrawing from the city. Even the wars of the crown faltered, for there were not enough men to fight. But the plague did not linger only in the capital. It spread outward, seeping into the villages of the countryside, gnawing at the fabric of England itself. Imagine a village in Sussex. A cluster of wattle and daub cottages, smoke curling from their chimneys, fields rippling with barley. The parish church stands at the centre, its bell calling the faithful to mass. Then, one by one, the villagers fall. The reeve collapses in the field, the plough still cutting its furrow. The miller coughs blood onto his stones. The vicar, summoned to offer last rites, himself grows fevered. The church bell tolls, then falls silent when no one remains to ring it. By harvest time, the fields are empty. By winter, the village is a ghost. This was the fate of hundreds of English villages. Some were repopulated in later years, others were abandoned forever, their names surviving only in parish rolls and whispers. Today, they are deserted medieval villages, their outlines faint in the earth, the memory of plague etched into the landscape. The social order trembled. England in the mid-14th century was a feudal realm. Lords held lands, peasants worked them, rents and labour bound the two in mutual obligation. But when the peasants died, the fields lay empty. Lords looked out from their manor halls to see crops rotting, livestock wandering, rents unpaid. The backbone of the realm cracked. Those peasants who survived found themselves in a new position. Labour was scarce. Fields needed ploughing, sheep needed tending, but hands were few. Peasants began to demand higher wages, better terms, even freedom from serfdom itself. In some regions, they abandoned their manors, moving to towns or to lords who offered better conditions. For the first time in centuries, the power of the peasant rose. The ruling class resisted. Parliament passed the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, forbidding workers to leave their lords, threatening punishment for disobedience. But laws written on parchment could not bind empty stomachs. Men and women ignored the decrees, moving where work was plentiful. Authority itself had begun to crumble. The church, too, staggered. With so many priests dead, parishes went unserved. In desperation, the church ordained men with little training, filling the pulpits with those barely literate in Latin, sometimes barely Christian in their learning. Respect for clergy declined. Stories spread of priests who abandoned their flocks, of monks who fled their cloisters, of bishops who grew rich charging for burials. Faith, already shaken, frayed further. And yet, amid the ruin, piety burned fiercely in some places. Survivors gave thanks for their lives by endowing chapels, founding chantries, commissioning masses for the dead. The plague scarred faith, but it also deepened it, making mortality the central fact of devotion. Chroniclers in England left vivid testimonies. The monk Henry Knighton wrote that, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world." Another, writing from York, recorded that the people died by the thousands, and none were left to bury the dead. The royal clerk Thomas Walsingham noted that there was such a shortage of labour that scarcely half the land was sown. Their words are heavy with despair, but also with awe, an attempt to capture an event beyond comprehension. The plague's grip on England did not end in 1349. It lingered, flaring again in waves. In 1361 came the pestilence of children, striking especially the young, who had been spared in the first wave. Families who had survived once were hollowed a second time. Again the bells tolled, again the pits opened. England lived under the shadow of recurrence, and yet, even in the midst of ruin, change stirred. The scarcity of labour shifted power. Serfs walked away from bondage. Wages crept upward despite laws. Lords turned to sheep farming, less dependent on human toil, beginning the transformation of the English economy. The old feudal bonds loosened, setting the stage for revolts yet to come. The Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381, born of plague's legacy. Culture, too, darkened. English writers spoke more of death, of time, of the vanity of life. In the churchyards, new carvings showed skulls and bones, grim reminders that none could escape. The very air of England grew heavy with mortality. Picture London in 1349 one last time. The streets are empty. A cart rolls by, piled with corpses, the driver calling out hoarsely, "Bring out your dead." The doors of shops hang open, goods untouched. The river stinks of rot. A few survivors stumble through the lanes, clutching herbs to their noses. Overhead the bells toll. And in the countryside beyond, in villages scattered across the green fields, the silence is deeper still. No carts, no bells, only empty cottages, broken ploughs, wandering cattle. England had been struck to its heart. The plague had arrived, and with it the unravelling of an order centuries old. But even as the dead lay in pits, the living began to reckon with what came after. For the Black Death was not only an ending, it was also a beginning, and for those who survived the question was, what world would rise from the ruin? When the bells grew quiet, when the smoke of the pyres thinned, when the last pits were heaped with soil, the survivors emerged into a world unrecognisable. The Black Death had not ended cleanly. It lingered, flaring in pockets, returning in waves. Yet by the early 1352, the great storm of pestilence had passed. In its wake lay silence, emptiness, and a question: what comes after? Those who stumbled from the ruins of the plague carried not only grief but possibility. For in losing so much, Europe had been remade. The survivors were few. In some regions, half the population had perished. In others, 2/3. Whole villages stood deserted. Families had vanished. Houses, fields, and shops lay without heirs. A man who survived might inherit not only his father's land, but his uncles', his cousins', his neighbours'. Wealth, once thinly spread, collapsed into the hands of the living. For peasants, this was revolution. Before the plague, most were bound by feudal ties, serfs tied to their lords' estates, owing labour and rent, trapped in cycles of duty. After the plague, the scarcity of workers gave them leverage unknown for centuries. A man could demand higher wages, lighter rents, even freedom. If one lord refused, he could walk to another. Fields stood empty, and every hand was precious. Chroniclers complained bitterly. "Servants are scarce," wrote Henry Knighton in England, "and they demand wages beyond measure." Men and women of low estate are now clothed in silks, who once knew only rags. To the nobles and clergy, this was scandalous. To the peasants, it was justice. The Ordinance of Labourers, passed in 1349, sought to chain wages to their old levels, forbidding workers from bargaining, punishing those who fled their lords. But laws written on parchment could not erase hunger or desire. The peasants pressed their advantage. The feudal order cracked. In towns, too, the survivors discovered opportunity. Merchants who endured inherited not only wealth but empty markets. Guilds, once closed and rigid, suddenly needed new members. Apprentices rose swiftly to masters. Widows inheriting shops from dead husbands took up trades long barred to women. The plague's scythe cut down barriers as well as lives. In Florence, Boccaccio observed how quickly fortunes shifted. Families once mighty were extinguished. Upstart merchants, heirs to dead rivals, rose in their place. The social map redrew itself in months, not generations. The plague was indiscriminate, but its aftermath created new hierarchies, new powers, new hungers. For the survivors were not only richer in goods, they were richer in perspective. Every man and woman who endured the pestilence had lived with death at their side. They had buried parents, children, lovers, neighbours. They had walked streets lined with corpses, breathed air heavy with decay, watched priests fall at the altar. They knew the fragility of life as no generation before. Some emerged, hardened, determined to seize every pleasure. They feasted, drank, and revelled, convinced that tomorrow might bring another pestilence. Chroniclers railed against such excess, condemning the lewd dances, the drunken feasts, the lecherous abandon. But for the survivors, indulgence was not sin, it was survival. Others emerged devout, their faith sharpened by fire. They founded chantries, endowed churches, commissioned masses for the dead. In England and France, thousands of altars were built, each a plea for the souls lost to the plague. The survivors clung to ritual, desperate to believe that the dead were not forgotten, that eternity had not swallowed them without prayer. Between these two extremes, reckless indulgence and fervent piety, the survivors stumbled forward, scarred but alive. The plague also transformed families. With so many dead, inheritance leapt in unexpected directions. Daughters who would never have inherited now received land. Widows found themselves heads of households. Orphans were taken into monasteries, their lives forever shaped by loss. Marriage patterns shifted. Younger unions, quicker remarriages, desperate attempts to rebuild what had been lost. The very rhythm of life altered. People married younger, bore children sooner, sought to fill the emptiness the plague had carved. And yet, no family was whole. Every hearth bore absence. Survivors carried not only opportunity, but grief too vast to measure. Psychological scars lingered. Chroniclers describe people unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of corpses, of pestilence rising from the ground, of skeletons dancing in their homes. Survivors flinched at coughs, at fevers, at the faintest swellings. They lived with an invisible terror, knowing the plague might return at any time, and return it did. In 1361, a second wave struck, called the pestilence of children, for it carried off the young who had been spared before. Families who had rebuilt were broken again. The bells tolled once more. The survivors of the first plague became mourners again, their scars torn open. The fear of recurrence became a permanent part of life. Every rumour of sickness sparked panic. Every summer heat, every bad wind, every strange alignment of the planet seemed a herald of pestilence. Europe lived in the shadow of return, and yet, in that shadow, new things grew. Economically, the scarcity of labour transformed Europe. Wages rose, mobility increased. Lords unable to compel labour turned to new forms of farming sheep for wool, less dependent on men. This shift laid the foundation for Europe's later commercial revolutions. Socially, the old hierarchies crumbled. The gap between noble and peasant narrowed. Revolts brewed. In England, the peasants' revolt of 1381 would rise directly from plague's legacy, as serfs demanded freedoms their fathers had never dreamed possible. Culturally, obsession with death reshaped art and literature. Skeletons, skulls, and decay became common motifs. Writers dwelt on mortality, time, and the vanity of life. The dance of death spread across Europe, a philosophy as much as an image. Even medicine changed. Though the plague doctors had failed, their presence spurred new debates. The inadequacy of old cures forced scholars to question Galen, to consider new ideas of contagion, to experiment. The path to modern medicine was paved in plague pits. Imagine the sight of Europe in the 1350 seconds. Villages half empty, weeds crawling over once ploughed fields, cities quieter, their markets less crowded, their guild halls half deserted. castles echoing, their halls stripped of servants, and yet, amid the ruin, survivors moving forward, ploughing abandoned fields, reopening shops, marrying, bearing children. Life, stubborn as grass, pushed through the cracks of death. But it was a different life, a life haunted by memory, shaped by loss, sharpened by opportunity. A life that knew the world could collapse in a breath, and therefore clung fiercely to both pleasure and devotion. This was the survivor's world, a world both broken and reborn. The Black Death had written itself not only into graves but into the hearts of the living. Those who survived carried it forward in their choices, in their fears, in their rebellions. The old world had died. A new one had begun, born from ashes. And yet, the survivors knew one terrible truth. Death might come again. The plague had not finished its dance. The Black Death ended lives. But it also ended certainties, customs, and ways of seeing the world. In its aftermath, Europe did not return to what it had been before. The survivors, haunted and altered, carried the plague into their art, their architecture, their literature, their rituals. Death became not only a presence in daily life but a permanent obsession, shaping an age. The cultural aftermath of the pestilence was as profound as its physical devastation. The dead filled pits. The living filled their imaginations with death. In the years before the plague, medieval art had celebrated glory, the radiance of Christ, the triumph of saints, the majesty of kings. Cathedrals soared with light, their stained glass a rainbow of heaven's promise. Manuscripts glittered with gold, their margins crowded with angels and flowers. Death was acknowledged but distant, a passage into eternal joy. After the Black Death, the imagery darkened. Walls of churches once painted with saints now bore grim murals of skeletons, worms, and rotting corpses. The Danse Macabre appeared across Europe, death, skeletal and mocking, leading men and women of every rank into the grave. These images did not comfort, they reminded, they warned. Tombs, too, changed. Where once knights lay in marble repose, hands folded in prayer, now their effigies showed them as decayed bodies transy, corpses wrapped in shrouds, ribs exposed, skin shriveled. The message was plain. This, too, is what you will become. Even jewellery and household objects bore the mark of death. Rings were engraved with skulls, mirrors with mottos like, Memento Mori, remember that you must die. The plague had made mortality the most fashionable subject in Christendom. Literature absorbed the darkness. In Italy, Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, framing tales of wit, love, and folly within the shadow of the plague. 10 young nobles fleeing Florence to a country villa tell stories to pass the time as the city dies behind them. The tales are playful, bawdy, satirical, but their frame is grim. Laughter itself becomes an act of defiance against death. In England, poets turned their pens to mortality. William Langland's Piers Plowman depicted visions of death and judgment. Later, Chaucer would lace the Canterbury Tales with echoes of plague-time storytelling. Even humour became shadowed, for every jest carried the knowledge of death at its heels. Across France, Germany and Spain, sermons thundered on the brevity of life. Ballads mourned beauty that faded like grass, wealth that vanished in a day, breath. Writers dwelt on the image of the wheel of fortune spinning, spinning, casting down kings as easily as peasants. The plague had carved mortality into language itself. Ritual, too, transformed. Funerals, once rich with procession and chant, were stripped to their bones. Too many died for ceremony. Too few priests survived to sing masses. Families buried their dead in haste, sometimes without rites at all. This trauma lingered. Survivors, desperate to make amends, endowed chantries and chapels in the years that followed. Thousands of new altars appeared, each dedicated to prayers for the dead. The living tried to heal the rupture by filling the world with masses, candles, and memorials. But the rituals never regained their innocence. The memory of unshriven corpses haunted Europe. Faith endured, but it was darker, more anxious, obsessed with penance, judgment, and the grave. Architecture bore scars as well. The great cathedrals slowed. In some cases, construction halted entirely as funds dried up and workers perished. When building resumed, styles shifted. The radiant optimism of high Gothic gave way to heavier forms, sterner facades, more sombre tones. In England, the perpendicular style rose tall, stark, its vertical lines less a vision of heaven than a prison of stone. Even the smaller parish churches reflected the change. Carvings of saints now stood beside carvings of skeletons. Windows that once blazed with biblical triumphs now glimmered with scenes of plague and penance. Death was carved into the very walls of Christendom. Music, too, echoed with mortality. Chants for the dead multiplied. The Dies Irae, the hymn of Judgment Day, was sung with new fervour. Composers wrote laments heavy with grief, their melodies echoing the toll of bells. Even secular music bore the shadow. Songs of love carried refrains of death, ballads of laughter ended in mourning. The soundscape of Europe became one of elegy. The cultural aftermath was not only grim, it was also inventive, for in the vacuum left by collapse, survivors experimented. Freed from old hierarchies, artists and writers dared new forms. In Florence, humanism began to stir, its focus shifting from heavenly perfection to human experience, perhaps because the plague had shown how fragile and fleeting that experience was. In art, the study of anatomy deepened, fueled by the memory of bodies seen in plague pits. In literature, storytellers embraced realism, recording the flaws and follies of men alongside their virtues. The plague had shattered illusions. What remained was sharper, harsher, more human. Even laughter carried the mark. In taverns and markets, jokes about death abounded. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, became more than proverb, it was survival. Gallows humour, grim and biting, flourished. People laughed at skeletons, mocked priests, jeered at doctors, sang ballads about corpses. Humour was a shield, a way of looking the plague in the face and refusing despair. This mingling of horror and jest became a cultural hallmark. The dance of death itself often had a mocking tone, skeletons capering like jesters as they dragged bishops by the sleeve or snatched maidens from weddings. Death was not solemn. He was playful, cruel, laughing. To laugh with him was to endure him. The obsession with death bled into philosophy. Scholars wrote treatises on the brevity of life, on the certainty of decay, on the vanity of human ambition. The university classrooms, emptied by plague, filled again with new debates. Could the pestilence be explained by natural causes? Were the stars to blame, or the air, or human sin? The inadequacy of old answers opened the way for new ones. Though centuries would pass before science replaced superstition, the Black Death was a step along that path. It forced men to question, to doubt, to search. But perhaps the deepest cultural aftermath was not in art, nor architecture, nor literature, nor ritual. It was in the imagination itself. The survivors lived in a world where death walked beside them, where every cough might be a herald, where every feast might be the last. They imagined death not as distant but as intimate dancing, jesting, whispering in their ears. They carried that vision forward into every part of life. The child who saw skeletons painted on church walls grew to carve them into tombs. The widow who watched her husband thrown into a pit endowed a chantry to sing for his soul. The poet who lived through the pestilence wrote of mortality in every line. The Black Death had written itself into Europe's very imagination. Picture a small parish church in England, rebuilt after the plague. On its walls is a mural, a line of skeletons, hand in hand with kings, priests and peasants. Beneath it, the villagers gather for mass. They look up, seeing themselves mirrored in the figures rich and poor alike dancing toward the grave. They sing hymns, their voices thin but fierce. They know the truth. Death is not only at the end of life. Death is present in life itself, and yet, by naming it, by painting it, by dancing with it, they endure it. The cultural aftermath of the plague was paradox. It darkened art, but it also enriched it. It scarred faith, but it also deepened devotion. It mocked human pride, but it also inspired human creativity. It filled Europe with despair, but it also planted the seeds of rebirth. The survivors carried scars in their bodies and their souls. But they also carried a new vision of the world, fragile, fleeting, mortal but alive. The Black Death had ended one age. It had given birth to another. And yet, even as art and ritual absorbed its lessons, the plague itself was not finished. The 1,350 seconds brought quiet, but whispers persisted. The disease was not gone. It would return, again and again, each wave weaker, but no less terrifying. The dance of death was not a metaphor. It was a prophecy. The plague would come again. The Black Death did not. Leave with the silence of the bells in 1351. It did not vanish with the filling of the last plague pit. It lingered, waiting in the shadows, returning in waves that rolled over Europe again and again. The great storm had passed, but its thunder never ceased. For centuries the people of Europe lived under the shadow of return. The first recurrence came swiftly. In 1361, barely a decade after the Great Mortality, the pestilence returned. Chroniclers called it the Children's Plague, for it seemed to strike especially at the young. Those who had survived the first visitation often carried some resistance. Their children, however, were defenceless. Families that had endured once were shattered anew. Bells that had only just fallen silent tolled again, echoing with cruel familiarity. In England, the monk Henry Knighton recorded that, in this second pestilence, children and youths perished, and many noble families were left without heirs. Across France and Germany, the story was the same. The young, the future itself, were cut down. The survivors of the first plague, who had rebuilt their lives with trembling hands, found themselves mourning all over again. The pits opened once more. The fear returned sharper than before, for now they knew what to expect. The plague came again in 1369, then in 1375, then in 1390. It became a rhythm, a grim drumbeat echoing across generations. Each visitation was less catastrophic than the first, but no less terrifying. The very memory of 1347-1351 haunted the survivors. Every cough was suspect, every swelling a herald of doom. Rumours spread quickly. The plague is in Bordeaux. It has reached Lubeck. It is in York. Panic rose before the disease itself. People fled towns at the first whisper, scattering like birds before a storm. The plague had become more than a disease. It was a spectre, an expectation, a permanent companion of European life. Cities and kingdoms attempted defences. Venice established quarantine stations on islands, requiring ships to wait 40 days before landing. Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, built the first formal quarantine laws in 1377, isolating travellers for 30 days later extended to 40. The very word quarantine was born of the plague's return. But the measures were only partly effective. Rats and fleas did not respect boundaries. Merchants bribed officials. Desperate travellers broke quarantines. Again and again the disease slipped through. Still, these early efforts marked the beginning of public health as an idea. The plague forced Europe to imagine collective defence against invisible enemies. It was a lesson written in blood. The Church, scarred from its failures during the first great outbreak, struggled to respond to the recurring waves. Priests still died in great numbers, but some parishes developed grim routines, hastily dug pits, abbreviated rites, endless funerals. The extraordinary became ordinary. Faith itself darkened further. The obsession with death, with judgment, with penance, deepened. Images of the dance of death multiplied, skeletons cavorting on walls and in manuscripts. Tombs showed the dead, not in serene slumber, but in grotesque decay. Sermons thundered endlessly on mortality. Europe had become a culture of death not only because of memory, but because the plague refused to depart. The repeated waves left political scars as well. In France, the 100 Years' War faltered. Armies thinned not only by battle but by pestilence. Campaigns ground to a halt as soldiers died in their camps. In England, royal revenues shrank as fields lay empty once more, as taxes went unpaid, as trade faltered. Germany fractured further into violence, local lords seizing abandoned lands. Each recurrence reminded rulers of their fragility. No crown could shield against the plague. Kings and princes fled their capitals like peasants fleeing villages. The image of monarchy itself dimmed, tarnished by helplessness. The recurring plagues also deepened social unrest. The first great mortality had already shaken the foundations of feudalism. With every new outbreak, those cracks widened. Lords struggled to hold their peasants. Wages rose again and again. Revolts flared in France, the Jacquerie of 1358. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Though these uprisings had many causes, the plague's legacy was always present. Labor shortages, new expectations, resentment of authority, all were born of pestilence. The return of the plague was not only a biological recurrence, it was a political one. Each wave reawakened the memory of collapse, stoking rebellion, reshaping the balance of power. In the imagination of the people, the plague became cyclical, almost seasonal. Chroniclers noted its timing, often in summer heat, sometimes after storms, sometimes when the stars aligned in ominous patterns. Astrologers mapped the heavens, declaring that new conjunctions of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars foretold fresh outbreaks. People scanned the skies with dread, seeing in comets and eclipses the shadow of pestilence. Superstition flourished, amulets multiplied, charms against plague sold in every market. Holy relics were carried in processions. Pilgrimages surged whenever pestilence loomed, and yet, each time, the plague returned, mocking prayers and talismans alike. The recurrence of the plague also ensured that art and literature never left death behind. Poets who had been children during the first wave grew up writing of mortality. Painters who had watched their families die filled canvases with skeletons and skulls. The obsession with death became generational. The plague was not one event, it was a climate, a condition of life. In Paris, murals of the Dance of Death stretched across charnel houses. In Lubeck and Basel, great paintings of skeleton processions lined church walls, stark reminders to congregations. In England, tombs showed knights not as heroes but as rotting corpses, their epitaphs warning the living to repent. The recurrence kept the memory fresh. The dance of death never faded, because death itself never ceased to dance. Picture Florence in 1361. The city has begun to recover. Trade is stirring again. Markets reopen. Laughter returns faintly to the streets. Then, the bells toll once more. The pestilence of children sweeps through. Families that had survived the first wave are undone. Mothers who had buried parents now bury their children. The sound of wailing fills the air again, as though the years between had been a cruel dream. Or picture London in 1369. Survivors who had rebuilt their shops shutter them again. Funeral barges drift once more along the Thames. The fields of East Smithfield, already thick with bones, gape open again. The ground is layered with the dead, one generation atop another, each wave writing itself into the soil. This was Europe for centuries, a rhythm of return, a pulse of pestilence. The plague did not end in the 14th century. It haunted the 15th, the 16th, the 17th. Each century knew its visitations. Towns emptied, villages withered, bells tolled. Even when the scale was smaller, the terror was the same. Parents whispered stories of the great mortality to children, only to see them die in new waves. Memory became prophecy. It was not until the 18th century that plague finally loosened its grip on Europe. Quarantine measures grew stricter, trade routes shifted, the cycles waned, but for 400 years, Europe lived in its shadow. The return of the plague ensured that the Black Death was not a single wound, but a chronic disease of civilization. It carved itself into memory, into culture, into ritual. It made death not an exception but an expectation. The survivors of 1,351 could not escape it. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren all knew its touch. Europe became a continent of mourners, generation after generation. And yet, even in recurrence, life continued. Fields were ploughed, cathedrals built, poems written, wars fought. Humanity did not stop, but it lived with the constant knowledge that death might return at any moment. The dance of death had no end. The plague had returned, the plague would return, and Europe, scarred and altered, would never forget. The bells have fallen silent, the pits are closed. The last carts have rattled down the cobbles, their wheels creaking, their burdens emptied into the earth. The plague, that invisible enemy, that apocalyptic storm, has loosened its grip for now. But silence is not the same as peace, for in its wake, the Black Death left more than empty houses and overgrown fields. It left memory, it left imagination, it left scars that never faded. Europe did not emerge unchanged. It emerged haunted. The survivors of the Black Death carried the weight of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. A father who had buried 6 children before the plague's end could not simply return to the plough as if nothing had happened. A mother who had thrown her husband into a pit without rites could not pray with the same certainty she once had. A priest who had watched his monastery reduced to corpses could not chant the psalms without hearing the echoes of silence. Memory itself became a form of plague spreading, lingering, shaping the thoughts of generations. In every village, the earth held secrets. Farmers ploughed fields where bones still lay beneath the soil. Children played in lanes where neighbours had once collapsed. Churches stood over charnel pits, their walls painted with the dance of death, their windows glowing with images of saints who had not answered prayers. The very landscape became a graveyard. In cities, the memory was even sharper. Markets rebuilt themselves, guild halls reopened, but beneath their foundations lay layers of bones. London's East Smithfield, Paris's Holy Innocents, Florence's plague pits all became silent. Testaments, invisible beneath the cobblestones, yet ever present in the minds of those who walked above. To live in post-plague Europe was to live atop the dead. The cultural memory was not gentle. It was not softened by time. It was raw, brutal, unflinching. Art and literature reminded the survivors at every turn. Murals of skeletons mocked the living. Tombs depicted the dead as decaying flesh. Sermons thundered on mortality. Poems dwelt on life's brevity. Even laughter bore the mark of gallows humour. The Black Death had carved death into the imagination, and the imagination carved it into stone, ink, and song. The message was inescapable. Life is fleeting, death is certain, judgment is near. And yet, the very obsession with death was also a defiance of it. By naming it, painting it, singing it, Europe made death bearable. The Black Death forced the living to stare into the abyss and then to speak of it endlessly until it became part of life itself. But memory alone cannot explain the plague's legacy. Myth also took root, twining itself with fact, blurring the boundary between history and legend. Some swore they had seen angels pass over villages, swords dripping with blood. Others told of demons dancing on rooftops, scattering poison dust into the air. Tales spread of entire ships found adrift, their sails torn, their decks filled only with the bodies of plague-dead sailors. Travellers whispered of ghostly processions of the dead wandering roads at night, of bells tolling with no hand upon their ropes, of wells that bubbled black with poison. The siege of Kaffa, where Mongols were said to have hurled corpses into the city, became a myth of plague's origin. Whether true or not, it captured the imagination, death as weapon, death as curse. These legends were not dismissed. They were believed, repeated, embroidered. They became part of the plague's reality, for to the medieval mind, myth was not falsehood, it was explanation. Where fact faltered, myth gave meaning. The Black Death became both history and fable, woven together in a tapestry of terror. Its legacy was also political. The collapse of feudal labour, the rise of wages, the spread of revolt all sprang from the plague. The peasants who demanded freedom in 1381 carried not only grievances of tax and law, but the memory of plague. They knew that death had made them powerful, that scarcity gave them leverage. The revolts failed in the moment, but the seed was planted. Europe's old order was cracked forever. The Church, too, never recovered its full authority. Faith endured, but it was shaken. The silence of God during the pestilence, the death of priests in equal measure with sinners, the corruption of clergy who survived all left scars. Centuries later, when men like Martin Luther and John Wycliffe would challenge the Church, they drew upon soil fertilized by plague. The Black Death had sown doubt, and doubt would one day flower into reformation. Even medicine, though powerless in the 14th century, was changed. The failure of bleeding, purging, and charms forced questions. Could disease have natural causes? Could contagion be studied, understood, resisted? The road to science was long and uneven, but it was paved with plague corpses. The Black Death did not simply destroy, it transformed. And yet, even as it transformed, it never left. The great mortality of 1347-1351 was only the first wave. The plague returned, again and again, across centuries. Each return was smaller, but each carried the echo of the first. Parents whispered stories of the Black Death to their children, only to see them die in new outbreaks. The memory was not only history, it was prophecy fulfilled. Europe lived in the shadow of recurrence. Every summer fever, every cough, every rumour of sickness was a reminder that the dance might begin again. And so it did, until the 17th century, when plague finally waned in the West. But even then, the memory lingered. The 18th, the 19th, the 20th centuries all carried the stories of the Black Death as part of Europe's inheritance. Even in the modern age, when science named the bacterium and mapped its path, the myths remained. The Black Death became more than an event. It became a symbol. It symbolized fragility, that human life, no matter how proud, could be swept away in a breath. It symbolized equality, that kings and peasants alike danced to the same tune. It symbolized cruelty, that in terror men turned on their neighbours, burning scapegoats, murdering the innocent. It symbolized resilience, that even amid devastation, survivors rebuilt, laughed, loved, and carried on. The Black Death was Europe's apocalypse, and Europe survived it, but it did not forget. Even today, its shadow lingers. When new plagues strike cholera, influenza, Colorado VID, the memory of the Black Death rises. Quarantine, masks, fear of strangers, whispers of conspiracy, accusations of scapegoats, all echo the 14th century. The world changes, but the dance is the same. The Danse Macabre, painted on the walls of medieval churches, was not only a medieval vision, it was a prophecy of humanity itself. Death dances with all, in every age. Picture the image one last time. A skeleton, grinning, stretches out a hand. Beside him stand a king in his crown, a bishop with his crozier, a peasant with his hoe, a maiden with her flowers, a child with his toy. One by one, they take the hand. The fiddle plays, the circle turns. Flesh decays, crowns fall, prayers fade, songs end. But the dance goes on. This was the lesson of the Black Death. Not only that death is inevitable, but that it is universal. Not only that humanity perishes, but that it persists. The dance does not end, but neither does life. And so the curtain falls on Europe's darkest chapter. The bells have stopped tolling, the smoke has cleared, the graves are full. But the echoes remain in art, in memory, in the very fabric of history. The Black Death was not simply a medieval disaster. It was a mirror held up to humanity, revealing resilience, cruelty, faith, despair. It was, and is, a dance that never ends.